Good evening. I'm Eric Rube, President of the Board of Trustees of the Mark Twain Library. And on behalf of the library and the Reading League of Women Voters, welcome to the second installment of the series Conversations, Truth, Myth, and Democracy. We are honored to have Dr. Daniel Barrett as the moderator for tonight's program. A professor in and the chair of the Department of Psychology at Western Connecticut State University, and the recipient of numerous awards and fellowships, Dr. Barrett is the author of the textbook, Social Psychology, Core Concepts, and Emerging Trends. His research interests include suspicion, persuasion, social influence, and cross-cultural psychology. And he's also a resident of Reading, and it's a privilege to have him with us this evening. Now, this program follows a number of collaborative conversations organized by the Reading League of Women Voters and the Mark Twain Library, whose partnership in this endeavor began in the fall of 2019. The series is brought to you in association with the Easton Public Library, Weston Public Library, Friends of the Weston Public Library, Newtown's C.H. Booth Library, the League of Women Voters of Weston, and the League of Women Voters of Northern Fairfield County, and with support from WSHU Public Radio. Narrations, our personal stories and histories as we understand them, tell us a bit about who we are as a nation. The way in which these stories and ideas get passed down through the generations has an impact on how we see each other today. Our idealized view of the past has typically been one where Americans were somehow on the same page back when perhaps pasta was still universally known as spaghetti, when aerobics were simply jumping jacks, back when your dad drove Chevys or Fords, but not both. But it was never that simple. Only in our romanticized past has the messiness of our society been considered a blessing by its contemporaries. America has never, in all but the most narrow of senses, added up. And so, if we are to hold to the ideals of this nation and to honor the sacrifices of those who got us here, we have to talk about these things. These are weighty matters, and they are personal matters, to say the least. Now, we are recording tonight's program, so feel free to let your friends and neighbors know if they were not able to join us tonight, since the recording of the program will be available to view in a few days on the library's YouTube channel. There will be time for questions towards the end of this program, and you are welcome to put your questions in the Q&A function at any time. We are also offering closed captioning, and buttons for both of these features are on the toolbar at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And now friends and neighbors, it is a privilege this evening to welcome Dr. Daniel Barrett to Conversations.
Thank you, Eric, and good evening and welcome to another event in our series of conversations on truth, myth, and democracy. I want to thank the Mark Twain Library and the Reading League of Women Voters, of which I'm a proud board member, for organizing tonight's event. The conversation series is a grassroots effort to continue to examine the underlying meaning of democracy in our country and how democracy matters even when we have different ideas about what it should look like. Tonight, we are truly honored to have two outstanding Civil War historians as guests, Dr. Charles Dew and Dr. Ty Sudgely. Both men grew up in the South and imbibed and embraced the racist, pro-Confederacy attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors of their families, their friends, and their communities. Fortunately, for both men, as well as for us, their historical research and their soul-searching journeys led them to very personal revelations about their own beliefs. Doctors Dew and Sudgely later rejected their racist upbringing and now see themselves, the South, and indeed the US history itself, very differently than they did when they were younger. I want to add that I read their books and I greatly enjoyed both of those. And let me introduce them now. So first is Dr. Charles Dew, who is the Ephraim Williams Professor of American History at Williams College. He's a native of St. Petersburg, Florida. He attended Williams College prior to completing his PhD at the Johns Hopkins University under the direction of C. Van Woodward. He's the author of the Fletcher Pratt award-winning Apostles of Disunion, Southern Secession Commissioners, and the Cause of the Civil War, and also a Bond of Iron, Master and Slave at Buffalo Forge, which was selected as a New York Times Notable Book of the Year. And most recently, his 2016 memoir, The Making of a Racist, A Southerner Reflects on Family History and the Slave Trade. So welcome, Dr. Dew. Next, we have Dr. Ty Sudgely, who is the Chamberlain Fellow of visiting professor of history at Hamilton College and Professor Emeritus at West Point. A recently retired Brigadier General who served more than 3 decades in the US Army, he graduated from Washington and Lee and holds a PhD from the Ohio State University in history. He co-edited the award-winning West Point History of Warfare. And his recent book, Robert E. Lee and Me, A Southerner's Reckoning with the Myth of the Lost Cause, was published in 2021. So welcome, Dr. Sudgely. The plan for tonight is that I will get the conversation going with some questions and prompts that I'll address to our guests. I'd like the discussion to be somewhat free-flowing, and so I encourage both of our guests to respond to each other as we go through the different topics tonight. At around 8:30 or so, we'll turn to audience questions, and then we'll wrap up around 9 p.m. Sound good? Very good. So let's start with the first question. Historians, like researchers in many disciplines, including psychology, are taught to take themselves out of the equation when conducting their academic work. That is, they have traditionally been encouraged to strive for objectivity in the sense that they should push aside their personal biases, perspectives, and preferred outcomes, and let the findings, the archives, the documents, the oral accounts, etc., speak for themselves and tell their own truths. Most history books that I have read have very little I in them, yet the two of you took a very different approach to writing the books we're talking about tonight. You decided to employ your personal stories, your own developmental narratives as vehicles for telling the story of America's history with racism and racism. Can you tell us what led you to do this? And why don't we start with Dr. Dew?
That's a really good question. And I talked about that a little bit at the beginning of the book. I was trained in the sort of classic tradition. You don't put yourself in your history. We're social scientists. We don't do that. But I happen to be married to a novelist, and we read each other's work. And my wife, Rob Foreman Dew, was reading some of my material. And she said, "This sounds like stuff you've talked to me about that you grew up with in Florida." And I said, "It is." And she said, you should put that in. And I said, historians don't do that. And she said, that's stupid. Why don't they? And I married above my pay grade. And when my wife said something like that to me, I thought about it. And I realized that a lot of the rhetoric I was reading in the Old South defending slavery was eerily similar to what I had heard growing up as a boy in the Jim Crow South about segregation, and the racism and the language that was used to defend racism in the Old South was cut from the same cloth as the stuff that I heard growing up in the Jim Crow South. And I thought, as she suggested, that that was worth putting in. And I'm glad I did, because I've heard from some teachers who have taught it in the South that having their students who grew up sort of like I did, read my own personal words, made a difference.
Yes, I have a different, but in a way similar story. I was at West Point. I was chair of the memorialization committee, and we were about to create a new room sort of to recognize the West Point graduates killed in Iraq and Afghanistan. West Point lost 100 graduates, and I'm a soldier first. And so we were going to do this, and I got the money, I got the plans, I got everything together to the 1,500 names of West Point graduates who died from the War of 1812 through the War on Terror. And there was one problem, though, and that is that should those who wore Confederate gray, graduated from West Point, and died for the Confederacy, should they be in our new memorial room? And I argued, this was probably in the early 2010s, 2011, something like that. And I argued vociferously, no, because they abrogated their oath, they fought against their country, they killed U.S. Army soldiers for the worst possible reason to create a slave republic. And the building they were going in, our memorial hall, the money was given by an ardent anti-Confederate who said in his will, which became federal law, that he would never forgive those who forgot the flag to follow false gods. So I went and gave this impassioned argument using every fact. It was a slam dunk argument, both right and righteous, to this academic board, our decision makers. And when I got done with this, our college president, superintendent, three-star general said, no, I want to bring people together. I don't want us to be like the Sunni and the Shia, which is the worst historical analogy in the history of the world. So when this finished and I lost by over 2/3 vote, I went home, tail between my legs, head down, crushed that my evidence and brilliant argument made no difference whatsoever, and went and talked to my wife. And I talked to Sherry and I said, I lost, I couldn't do it. She said, well, tell me what you did. And she said, well, Ty, nobody understands why you're so passionate about this. You're hiding your own story about that. She said, the only way you're going to get people to convince people is to be vulnerable enough to tell your own story. And of course she was right. And I cogitated on this a little bit, because it's really vulnerable to put yourself into this position. But when I finally started doing this, I realized that I could, just as Charles said, I had an effect that I didn't realize I could have effect. So I did it to change more people's minds than I would by being a know-it-all historian.
We both buried well, Ty.
We did, above our pay grade, absolutely. And it is interesting that it is our wives that saw through the chaff of history in a way,
right,
to get to that kernel of truth.
Exactly.
Well, congratulations to both of you for marrying well. All right. So my next question is it's about your upbringing and culture, more widely speaking. So growing up in the South, you were both exposed to books and movies and monuments that instantiated and perpetuated false narratives and mythologies about the history of the United States. These books, movies, and stories from your childhood and young adulthood impacted not just the South, but all of the US, and even people in other countries. Can you talk a little bit about the widespread impact of these things growing up, and also how do they still affect us today? These movies and books are still out there, some of them are, and the monuments certainly are. And so just tell us about the impact on you growing up, and also more broadly speaking on US culture.
I think I'm senior here in years, but not in military rank, ties. So I'll lead off here. The baby picture on the dust jacket of my book, which was up during the preliminary video, When I first saw my baby picture on the dust jacket with "The Making of a Racist" as the title, gave me a little bit of a jolt, but then I realized that that was actually a perfect dust jacket photograph, because the earliest thing I remember about my life is having my mother read a children's book to me. And Ty, you and I have both kept those books. I know you've got your Robert E. Lee book. I've got Ezekiel, which is the children's book that my mother read to me. And my first memories as a human being are sitting in her lap and having her read this book to me. I found this when we were going through, my brother and I were going through the house after my mother died. And I pulled it off and I had this immediate memory of her reading this book to me. And then I opened it up and started reading, and I was appalled because the story is told entirely in dialect. And I'm going to read just a little bit of it to show you exactly what I remember about my life as the first thing. And Ezekiel is a little colored boy, it's all in dialect, in Sanford, Florida. Way down in Sanford, Florida, this is going to offend everybody, I'm telling you up front. Way down in Sanford, Florida, there lives a little colored boy, and he names Ezekiel. And he lived with his pappy and his mammy and his sister, Emancipation, and his brother, little plural, and asafoetted the baby. One time, Pappy didn't have no money to buy bread and butter and breeches and things. And so one morning, Ezekiel's dressing himself. He say, "Mammy, these here old breeches wore out. They won't hardly stay on." Mammy say, "How we gonna get us something to eat? Much less breeches. Your pappy ain't got no job." Ezekiel say, "I get us something to eat." And off he goes on his adventure. This is what I remember as the first thing about being in this world. And the fact that my mother read that to me without a second thought, and she was at the same time a remarkably kind, gentle, deeply religious person, remarkable in every way you could possibly imagine in terms of empathy and generosity. And she felt nothing amiss here, because she bought into the culture the same way that my father did and everybody else who I grew up with did. And that is that white folks are over here, black folks are over here. One is superior, one is inferior, and they should be kept separate for the betterment of both. My mother said those folks live on their side of town and they're happy over there. We live on our side of town, we're happy over here.
And I have a similar story. The first book I remember my father reading to me, and I remember I have two younger sisters. I would be on one side, my sister Nancy on another, and my sister Amy would be on his lap, and would read us the story of Uncle Remus through Disney, a Disney-fied version of Uncle Remus, and with Brer Rabbit, Brer Fox, also in dialect. And yet at the same time he was doing this at an age I remember, the school he was going to, he taught at Episcopal High School in Alexandria, was actually starting to integrate, and we had black kids come over to our house, but it didn't overcome this generations of racism through that. And the other book that Charles was mentioning, my first chapter book, I have it here as well, Meet Robert E. Lee,
Right.
That I wore the spine out on this book. And it makes Lee into, and you can see the Confederate flag in the background. He's holy up here. I mean, he's carrying his sword like a ceremonial race. Traveler, his horse, is so intelligent that he doesn't even need to put a hand on the reins because Traveler knows just where to go. And but you see up above here the little step up book that this is, and so there's only two black people in this book. One is an enslaved servant who is driving Robert E. Lee and his family from Stratford, their ancestral home when his father lost it, to Alexandria, Virginia, my hometown. And then the other picture of a black person in here is during John Brown's 1859 raid, when Lee went to put that down. And there are these crazed African Americans who are trying to kill the great Robert E. Lee. And of course, in this book, Lee was totally against slavery, He was the last great gentleman of the South, more like Washington than everyone else. And above, so I had these books above the mantle. We had the 4 flags of the Confederacy. And there was a picture in our house of Robert E. Lee, another picture of Stonewall Jackson, the 2 great Virginians. And I remember this. I can't remember life before Robert E. Lee. I mean, he was such a ubiquitous part. I can't remember anything. And I say this in the book, but on a scale of 1 to 10, I would have put Lee as a child at 11. And even though I went to church every Sunday as a good Episcopalian, I would have put Jesus in the 4, 5, 6 range. So it was a reverential understanding of Confederates, and with that, but there, of course, that was also a white supremacist vision of society as well.
So besides the books you're talking about, were there movies or other things that you were exposed to growing up that kind of perpetuated these false narratives of the South and of the Civil War and so forth?
Ty talks about Going with the Wind in his book. I didn't have a movie as powerful as that in my life, but Ty, I found your discussion of Going with the Wind intriguing, to put it mildly.
Well, I read that, Charles. I read that the first book. It was the first book I read where I understood the power of reading, that you can, and this is at the Mark Twain Library. There are plenty of people in the audience that understand that first book where you're so lost in reading it that you realize that reading is better than a TV show. And that's what Gone with the Wind was, even though it's a cinder block of a book. And it was the copy I had was translucent paper, tiny font, but I read it through in the 6th or 7th grade and then read it again. And then I went back and read it as an adult. Oh my gosh. The level of racism in there was just staggering. But I remember seeing that for the first time in 1975 when it first came on to TV. The first movie I saw was Song of the South, based on the Uncle Remus stories. And I could not wait to go see that. And not only had the books prepared me, but I also read the Uncle Remus comic strip in the Washington Post every morning. And then going to see this view of Song of the South is 1946, a Disney movie that was re-released up into, I think into the 80s, but which is a terribly racist, where white people with important white people problems and Black people are there for either work or for amusement. It was a deeply racist, and I'm so glad that Disney has put that in their vault and never shown it again. So yes, my entire culture had a white supremacist view.
So like you, Ty, I read and watched Uncle Remus when I was a kid. I grew up in New Hampshire. And even though we were up in the North, the true Yankee North, I still was exposed to some of the same things you were, down in the South. And as a kid, honestly, I felt nothing about it. I thought it was funny, interesting. I really had no questions as to what it was there, what the propaganda was behind it, or so on and so forth. So obviously, I've changed my views now than what I had versus what I had when I was 5 or 6 or 8 or what have you. But those are powerful in the North as well.
And I'm teaching a course right now on Civil War memory and myth. And I brought, first day of class, I brought in the Uncle Remus book. I brought in Meet Robert E. Lee. I brought in a copy of my, in fact, I'll just show that this was I had my dad send it. This is the Civil War. If you can see the flags here, the 4 flags, and it has CSA here and Dixie down on the bottom. This was Charles and I both have good teachers that we are. We make sure we have props whenever we can. So anyway, I was telling them about this, and a young woman in my class, she's from Connecticut, said, "Oh, I've read that Song of the South book, the Disney Song of the South, just like you." She's 19 years old, and she's in Connecticut, and she's still reading that book.
Wow. All right, so let me ask another question. And of course, these are all related to each other. So we're obviously now in the 21st century. We're some hundreds of years past the Civil War. So why do you think the myth of lost cause and other remnants of the war and post-war period continue to have such a strong presence on the minds of so many people in the United States? There's been a resurgence recently in anti-Black and pro-Confederacy thinking and behaviors in recent years. We've seen an uptake in animosities and hostile violent behavior against other groups as well. So what insights can you offer us to why the nostalgic view, to quote the historian Stephanie Coontz, of the way we never were, maintains its place in our culture and our mental architecture?
Well,
Ty, you want to start this time?
I'll lead off on that one with a couple of observations. I think, first of all, there is too much misinformation out there about what caused the Civil War. And there is too much ignorance out there about what the institution of human bondage actually consisted of in the South. When you get to the causes of the Civil War, it's quite clear that the Deep South seceded, those 7 states that went out in the first wave, seceded to protect the institution of slavery, to make sure that the racial order that they had built on the foundation of slavery would be preserved. And they were, in fact, looking to expand slavery to the West, to the Caribbean, to Central America. The Deep South seceded because they saw Lincoln and the Republicans as an existential abolitionist threat to their racial order and the institution of slavery. This whole states' rights business about that being the underlying reason for secession or arguments over the tariff is poppycock. To put it politely. The South was looking to defend the institution of human bondage and everything that entailed. The South was more than a society with slavery. The South was a slave society. It was the absolute center of their economy, their political life, their culture, their social life, their religious life. The South and slavery were intermingled in ways that were impossible to separate. I won't get into detail on what slavery entailed. I think Ty has plenty of information on that in his book. It involved the brutal separation of families. It involved the forced migration of roughly 1 million human beings from the upper South to the lower South during the cotton boom in the 19th century. Corporal punishment, rape, you can go down the list of man's inhumanity to man, and you will find them involved in antebellum Southern slavery. It was also incredibly profitable. It was making fortunes for the South, for the Deep South selling the cotton and the upper South selling the slaves. And some of the richest men in the United States were planters. And they were making their income off what the world needed, short staple cotton. And they were growing it with slave labor and doing everything they could to maximize their production.
When you take your answer, could you summarize for us what the myth of the lost cause is and kind of what its origins were, please?
Yes. Well, first of all, if the first time I read Apostles of Disunion, it blew me away. And this is Charles, one of his magnus opus. But when he looked at the Southern Secession Commissioners and read this, I had never read this before. And when I read this, there's no way that you can come to any other conclusion than what Charles just did, which I think he just summarized brilliantly. Yeah, the lost cause of the Confederacy. So if Charles got us to the why the war was fought, then after the war, if you could imagine that they went to war, as Charles said, to not just support slavery, but to expand it. And they sowed the wind and they reaped the whirlwind. Not only was the slave society destroyed, but with the 13th Amendment that ended slavery, the 14th Amendment that created equal rights, and the 15th Amendment that gave all men the right to vote, they had actually created they had found a society where all people were, all men anyway, were equal, which is exactly 180 degrees from what they wanted. So the idea is, how do they deal with this defeat? And how do they then create a society where at least there's a racial hierarchy? And before the last gunpowder clears the battlefield, Robert E. Lee has started this idea, which is of the lost cause, which is one that they only lost because the North had more manpower, material, and money. This is one of the lost cause, which is not true. The United States, by the way, I don't say the North or the Union, I say the United States Army or the United States. If you say the Union, it makes it feels like it that you're talking about an organization that fought only one war. It was lost to history. This is the United States Army, same army that I served in, same army that Grant did, same army that George Washington picked the blue color that I wore for so many years. But the North won because it was better. Did it have more manpower? Yes, because it had immigrants. It had Black soldiers, which the South couldn't have because of the slave system. Nobody says that the Japanese or Germans just lost because they had fewer people. Well, there's a reason why, because their society was so terrible. So that's one. The second thing was that the war wasn't fought over slavery. And that's just, as Charles so eloquently said, poppycock. The third was enslaved people were happy and hardworking, that it was the best system of labor. This is after the war. And of course, that's not true either. As he said, slavery is an abomination. Another part of that lost cause myth is that Grant, the great general of the war, was a drunk and a butcher. Not true. He was the greatest commander of that war. In fact, I would argue the greatest soldier ever to wear U.S. Army blue. He captured 3 armies. He was the greatest strategic mind of the era. Another one was a part of this was that Confederate soldiers were the best ever. Well, if that's true, why did they lose? So they weren't better. Another one was that post-war Reconstruction was evil and a failure because Black people weren't ready for the vote or to serve in high office. Well, it was an attempt at biracial governance. It was 2,000 Black men served honorably and well. It was a good chance to create a truly just society. It failed in the end, but those laws would come back to help us in the 1960s. And at the top of the lost cause myth is Robert E. Lee, the finest man who ever lived, the greatest general, the greatest man. Well, we could talk about that later about Lee, but he did lose, and he didn't just lose by a little bit, he was destroyed. But the lost cause matters because in addition to segregation laws, white terror, lynching, Black disenfranchisement, and Confederate monuments, these are the pillars of a white society based on supremacy to ensure a racial hierarchy with Black people at the bottom.
So going back to my childhood for a minute, when I was in, I think it was in high school, maybe 9th grade, I took a class on the Civil War. And every myth you just talked about, Ty and Charles, was presented to me in my class. This is in New Hampshire again, that there were 8 or 10 causes of the Civil War, and slavery was just one small piece of that. And I was taught that very same misinformation growing up. And this again was in New Hampshire. So let's circle back for a second to language. You really raised this issue, Todd. I just want to push this a little more. So each of us is born into a culture and a language that deeply influences how we think about ourselves and our world. Language helps dictate what we see as well as what we are blind to, what we understand and misunderstand, how we divide the world into categories, such as good versus evil, desirable, undesirable, accepted, intolerable, and so on. In many ways, the words we use define our world. So for example, many people have changed their language of talking about the Civil War and about slavery and use enslaved peoples rather than slaves. Or Ty, as you do in your book, use enslaved labor camp rather than plantation. And as you said a few minutes ago, US Army, not the Union Army. And Charles, you explore the use of words and numbers in advertisements in the transactional letters pertaining to buying and selling and managing human beings in your book. So as historians, you both see firsthand how words and their meanings are so important. Can you elaborate on the role of linguistic choice in your own work and more broadly in our understanding of race, racism, and the Civil War?
I think as historians who are writing about Black history and who are white, you have to be aware of the sensitivity regarding language in a way that's appropriate and I think quite special. We have such a history of racism in this country, and when white scholars are looking at Black history, it's incumbent upon us, I think, to be sensitive to the way that the people, the descendants of the people we are studying, are going to read what we're writing. I don't think that means we pull any punches. I don't think it means anything about what we write in terms of validity of our history. But I think it shows a respect for the descendants of the people we're writing about to try and use language that they will consider appropriate and not offensive. In writing about how I grew up, I had to use some language that was outside of that category. And I put it in my book with some trepidation, but I thought, no, I've got to use this word and these words because that's what I absorbed growing up. That's the baggage I had to shed. But I don't think there's anything excessively politically correct about trying to find the right words to embrace what we're talking about as historians, so that all of the people who read it will be accepting of our approach to their material.
It's very well put. So he has both ways, and I put that word that is so horrible in my book as well, because it does talk about it evokes the horror of that era. But it was very difficult. I did the audio version of my book of saying that word in an audio version. And I mean, I tried to figure out how to do it. So I ended up saying it, but I put it in quotation marks, verbal quotation. It's tough. But I do think the language is important, and certainly I want to convince people, certainly people that are in the military as well, about these. That's when I was writing it. So there are things that I want to change the language so that people will view it differently. So whether it's an enslaved labor farm instead of a plantation, because plantation evokes Scarlet sitting on the porch of Terra as the wind whispers through the Spanish moss, which is, doesn't, to me, those enslaved labor farms are a site of mass atrocities. And that word helps as well, because we know what a mass atrocity site looks like. And that linkage between those other ones helps us see a plantation in different ways. Talking about coffle, the chain of human beings chained to one another, the smell of the slave market that Charles writes about so well. But I also think about what the South was that I was born into, that Charles was born into, was a racial police state. It was an apartheid state. It was not a democracy. And every time we think about, well, why were these things named, or why was this, we remember that it was Black people had been disenfranchised. There was absolute protest against some of these things, particularly in the 20th century. But when you have been violently disenfranchised, it doesn't allow that. So saying racial police state helps with that. And another word that I use over and over again is traitor, because I think of people that I served my 2/3 of my life, 3/4 of my life in the service of our nation to defend it, and people that chose to try to destroy it earn the phrase traitor. So all those phrases, though, when you say them out loud, it evokes spleen from people that aren't used to hearing them. I'm fine with that, but the word choices matter, and they rile people. They really do.
Hi, I thought one of the best things you did in your book was put the constitutional definition of treason, word for word, in your book. And there's no way you can read that constitutional definition and not say this applies to Robert E. Lee. It fits as closely as you could imagine.
It does. I mean, and for those of you listening, it's Article 3, Section 3, which I have memorized, which is levying war against the United States. There's only one crime in the Constitution, and that is treason. And the founders meant to limit the scope of it so that it wasn't for political gains, that you weren't using treason for politics. But when you levy, and it's got to have 2 witnesses. And if anybody ever had 2 witnesses that he levied war against the United States, it's Robert E. Lee.
Good. So that's another question then. So in the last few years, there's been increased scrutiny and widespread condemnation of the naming of buildings and streets and places and existence of monuments that celebrate aspects of the Confederacy and to individuals who enslaved people, supported slavery, supported Jim Crow, etc. When proposals are made to change these, they're often met by claims that changing the names and moving the monuments is in effect changing history. And this is something we are not supposed to do. As if there's something sacred about a particular version of history that we can't touch it. But history is always changing, whether we like it or not. Every time a monument is constructed, every time a new book about history is written and published, history is changing. Every time there's a new interpretation of history, in a sense, history can be said to have changed. Moreover, as the historian Eric Foner has argued, revising interpretations of the past is intrinsic to the study of history. I mean, it's what you do as historians, is you change how you understand the past. So what is your response to people who say, we can't change that name, we can't take down that monument because you're changing history? So how do you respond to that?
Ty has a brilliant description of how Confederate names got into things like military camps and well beyond that. I think one of the key points is that a lot of this naming took place at the same time that segregation was being hammered into law, that disfranchisement was being mandated by state constitutions. Mississippi was the first state to disfranchise its Black voters by constitutional means. That was 1890. It's about the same time these monuments, Confederate monuments, begin going up. It's about the same time Mississippi puts the battle flag of the Confederacy in their state flag. The monuments, the street names, the school names, and the rise of a segregated society, those things are joined at the hip. So they are not something that sprang full blown from the head of Zeus at the immediate end of the Civil War. They came in the late 19th, early 20th century as disfranchisement was taking place, as cradle to grave segregation was being written into law, and as Confederate monuments were going up all over the South. Those things happened in a sequence that's very telling and very important, I think.
And then the ones that come after World War II, after Brown versus the board, are reaction to integration. So you scratch a monument and you either have the ones like 1890, 1920, which are about enshrining white supremacy, or you have the ones after World War II, which are about a reaction against integration. And the other thing I tell people is that this isn't, let's say at West Point or wherever it is that you're going to change something named after Lee, doesn't mean that we're not going to study the Battle of Chancellorsville. It's not changing history, it's changing commemoration. And who we commemorate says something about our values as a society. And so we're not changing history, we're changing who we commemorate. The other part that I'd say is, which history is it that you exactly want? What's the period that you want to put your flagpole in one spot and say, this is the history that's accurate? Because if you said it, at least in the North and from the U.S. Army's perspective, the U.S. Army saw the Confederates as traitors up through the beginning of the 20th century. They were seen as traitors then. It's only after that that you start to see them as heroes for the first time. So you have to figure out which spot is your history that you want to put there. And when you say you don't want to change history, you are thereby saying that there's a spot in time, and it's a segregationist, racist time that you want to hold fast to.
And I think people might be interested in something about the Civil War monuments that dot the courthouses you see all over the South. They were basically sponsored by the Marietta Marble Company in Georgia. And they would send salesmen out to these county seats across the South while these Jim Crow laws are being written. And they would go to the local UDC chapter. It was kind of like the Music Man. You remember Harold Hill comes and River City doesn't have a brass band? Well, Halifax doesn't have a Confederate monument. You folks have got to get with it. The monuments were made in Indiana. The Marble Company sold the base. And they basically had these men working the South, going to UDC chapters, United Daughters of the Confederacy particularly, and saying, it's time to do something. So these things came about in that decade of the 1890s, first couple of decades of the 20th century, with somebody making some money off of it, but also appealing to white sensibilities at a time when segregation was being hammered into law. That this is something that will celebrate your Confederate past and everything that represents.
And I would also say that, at least in one of my hometowns of Monroe, Georgia, right in front of the courthouse, where they took several Black men out of jail and lynched them, because this is also the same time that lynching reaches its height. Again, the Confederate monuments are one pillar of that lost cause, one pillar of that white supremacist society. Lynching is another pillar, and as Charles said, these white supremacist constitutions, another pillar. So all of these create a deeply racist society to ensure white political power as well.
So I'm not sure if you both saw this, but today the Virginia Supreme Court decided that Charlottesville can in fact take down two statues in its town. One was of Lee and one was of Jackson. And that was decided today. So that's something we're going to see in the next few days, I think, as those statues coming down. So another question. One of the most powerful elements of the books that we're focusing on tonight is your personal stories, as we've already talked about briefly. Each of you specify or identify specific events in your lives that led you to change how you perceive yourselves and the world around you. In particular, sort of open your eyes to racism and to things of that nature. For example, Charles, you wrote about speaking with your the Black woman who lived in or worked, I should say, in your family's household, Illinois, and dialogue you had with her while you were driving her home from work. And so could each of you share with us what some of your transformative moments were growing up, or actually I guess as adults, in terms of changing how you view race and racism in the United States?
In my case, it was really important for me to get out of the South. Coming to Williams College as a 17-year-old, first time I'd been north of the Mason-Dixon line, and given my father's racist attitudes and how he felt about the South and Yankee land, it's an odd thing for me to go to Williams, and there's a story there, but I won't tell it at length now. Basically, he believed in a liberal arts education. He was the first member of his family to go to college, and he believed that the definition of an educated person was someone who wrote well and spoke well. And he was a lawyer. He ran into men in New York when he was up there doing business for clients who spoke well and wrote well, and a number of them had gone to Williams. So he looked into it and decided my brother and I should go here. Getting out of the South and getting into a college that was integrated. I had African-American classmates. First time I had shaken hands across the color line, was shaking hands with a classmate. The South that Ty and I grew up with had a sort of racial etiquette that governed the way white and black would interact. And that really precluded talking about anything of any substance. The weather, baseball, you could talk about a bunch of stuff, but you could never get into social justice. And as I found myself getting more and more but removed from my Jim Crow culture that I grew up absorbing, I did want to talk to Illinois about it, and I would drive her home after work. And I remember the day that I got her to speak with me. I knew it was dangerous for her to talk to a white person about this stuff. And I started the conversation saying, Illinois, I think it's too bad your son Roosevelt had to leave St. Petersburg because of something like race. And I remember she looked over at me and she didn't say anything right away. She was thinking whether she could trust me or not. And finally she said, yes, Charles, it is a shame that he had to leave because of race. And that opened it up. And she said something on one of our trips that is critical for my book. I was asking her how these Jim Crow things had come into being, these crazy things, stuff she told me. The department store would sell her a dress, wouldn't let her try it on. If she got home and it wouldn't fit, they wouldn't let her bring it back. How did all this stuff come into being? And I said, Illinois, I don't have any idea. Where'd this stuff come from? And she looked at me and she was practically in tears, I think. And she said, Charles, why do the grownups put so much hate in the children? And I knew as soon as she said that she had nailed it, that racism was passed through one generation of white Southerners to the next generation, almost like a genetic trait. And the key to getting out from under this rock was to break that chain. And that's basically why I wrote the book. I was thinking that maybe my experience and talking about how I was raised and how I had become a racist and how I got out from under would be helpful to some other people.
Yeah, and I wish I could say that I got it as quickly as Charles did, even though he's a couple of years older than me. I went to we had black students coming into our house when my dad was a teacher. When they first integrated there, I was bused across town to the black school. Robert E. Lee Elementary was the name of the black school I was bused to. Hard to believe. And I had a black teacher and I had a black principal. The only time in my life I've ever had a black teacher was when it was in the 6th grade. And so I knew that racism was wrong, yet I could still hold this reverential view of Confederates. I could hold those both. And I read the book Roots when I was 12 or 13 or 14, and I saw the evil of slavery there, but I was able to hold these diametrically opposed views in my head. I'm not quite sure how I was able to do that. And I went into the Army. I had black soldiers. I had black bosses when I was in the Army. And I never thought that I was a racist there. But again, it wasn't as though I could say that. And even when I started teaching, I was teaching that the Civil War, that the war was fought over slavery, but I could still hold this sort of reverential view of Lee. And then one day I was at West Point. I was living on Lee Road at Lee Gate by Lee in Lee housing area, and I walked to go get some swag for my family, some West Point swag. And I went by our barracks at West Point are named after the greatest heroes in American military history. I went by Eisenhower Barracks, Pershing Barracks, Grant Barracks, and then I went to the sign of Lee, and I just stopped and looked at it. And I said, why is there more things? And then I went running around campus. There are more things named after Lee at West Point than there was at W&L. And I couldn't figure out why. And I asked around, nobody did it. So I went into the archives because I could not answer this question. And what I found was that at West Point, there was nothing, as I said, named after them in the 19th century. So when did these things named after Lee come? Well, they come in the 1930s when Black cadets come to West Point for the first time in 50 years, a reaction to integration. They come in the early 1950s when the Army is supposed to integrate and fights it. And they come in the early 1970s when minority admission starts and we start bringing dozens of Black cadets rather than just a handful. So I found at the place I love, which was West Point, that they named things in reaction to integration. And that made me so angry at the institution I love, angry at myself for being such a thick-skulled, a numbskull for not seeing this sooner. And then when I found this in the archives, I couldn't stop. I had to know everything about it. And then I started to be righteous about it, of talking to everyone I possibly could about it. And I basically have never stopped.
Okay, so how have you two influenced each other? So you're historians, Ty, you mentioned in your book that you read Charles earlier tonight, you mentioned the same thing. So how have you influenced each other, and how have you influenced other historians out there? I know you've broken from tradition in terms of how you wrote your books. So how have other historians received your work?
Well, I'm very careful to tell junior people. One of the reasons I could do this was my age. Don't run afoul of the tenure committee by writing an autobiography too soon. Put your scholarship to bed. But I think that audiences are interested in who's behind the book. And I think having at least some discussion of how you were drawn. Every book has its own history. And to explain to a reader how you were drawn to this subject, what made you interested in this, why you decided to spend the years and the blood, sweat, and tears and your family's patience and resources doing this. So I think that there is a way to put yourself in your work without doing it as blatantly as Ty and I have. But I think that maybe the time has come for historians to be a little bit more upfront about where they came from, about what they're bringing to the table. We're not the pure social scientists that we're supposed to be. I don't think we can be. We bring our own personal history to what we study. So I've been encouraging my students, at least, to not be afraid to put themselves into what they write for me.
And I think Charles and I are we're a cohort of two, because I don't think there've been many other people that have done this, certainly not in this field. But it is something that Black feminists have done, that other Black scholars have done to great effect throughout history. But I think it is I think it's also interesting to read, and you can get a wider readership when you do this. And just as I'm not a social scientist, I think history is being storytelling with a purpose using facts. And the storytelling is the way I like to write. And I encourage my students to do that same thing of using stories. And we all have our own stories. And I think by using our own stories and using the skills that a historian brings to it makes the memoir a better memoir than if you don't have the skills of a historian. So I hope more people will do that, and that more historians will do it. And I think the reception that Charles had with his book was nothing but universal praise. And so I will say that he was a huge influence on me when I saw him give a talk in Lee Chapel, as a matter of fact, a couple of years ago, when I was thinking about writing this book. it was great for me to know that someone with his distinguished career had done that, and helped give me the courage to do it as well.
Could I just add, Ty, that your final chapter in which you describe your talk that you gave at Lee Chapel, I found that incredibly moving, and I could relate to that. It's intimidating to get up there with that recumbent marble statue of Lee as the backdrop and say what we said. But I think the reception that you got and the reception that I got is telling us something, and that is that the generations that are coming along want to put this stuff behind them. They don't want to forget about it, but they want to be better than that. And for you to get a standing ovation, having called Lee a traitor in Lee Chapel, I thought was a good sign, a good omen for the future.
I agree. It was, and I was, with the old Army saying is, I was nervous in the service to go down there and say that and call him not just a traitor, but a traitor for slavery. The reason he did it was because of his undying belief in slavery. But it really was, And I know the students now, they are not infected with this lost cause crap that I was, and my kids aren't. And I'm hoping that I will have grandchildren at some point. I'm certainly pressuring my children to do that, but I don't think they will either. So I do think, that we have an opportunity to get better, but we should always remember that every time there is this progress that about race, there is a backlash every single time. And part of it is for historians of white historians of a certain age like us to tell this truth of using these facts so that the backlash doesn't come, or if it does, that we're at least fighting it.
Yep.
So, Ty, would you mind just sharing with us the story of the chapel? I hadn't heard much about it until I read your book, and I was fascinated and horrified at the same time. And would you mind just sharing for readers or listeners who haven't read your book what that story was, what happened when you went there, and what the chapel represents?
Yeah, well, I think particularly, maybe the story I would tell on that is just my commissioning ceremony. So when I was commissioned I took an ROTC scholarship because I was a poor kid, didn't have enough money to get through college. And when I was commissioned, I was in my green uniform. I had a full head of hair back then, glorious. And as I went up on the stage, I went by and there was this picture of Lee in Confederate gray. I mean, with a sort of a halo of light around him. He was, you could almost hear the angels singing, oh. And then I went by and I grabbed my commission by the recumbent statue. So if you imagine that Lee Chapel it looks like a chapel. It's got everything that you would think of a chapel, except there's no pulpit, there's no place for a hymnal, there's no cross. Instead, the apse of the chapel, the sanctuary, where the Holy of Holies is, there's an altar. It's a white marble altar, but on top of the altar is a recumbent statue of Lee lying on the battlefield in Confederate gray with a blanket covering him except his boots. His right hand is over his heart. His left hand is on his scabbard of his sword. He's ready to rise up to fight for the white people of the South, to fight for his social system. He'll never die because he'll always be ready to fight again. And literally, Lee is the altar of that chapel. He is the Holy of Holies. And so I went and grabbed my commission, and around it was surrounded by Confederate flags. Then I went back into the pews and raised my right hand and gave the oath of office. It's the same oath that everyone in Congress takes, everyone in the federal government, all military officers. And it was written in 1862 that says, it says, support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Who are those domestic terrors? It's Confederates. Who's the purpose of evasion, says it? It's about Confederates. So I took an anti-Confederate oath surrounded by Confederate flags. And when I went back in there in 2017, I said in this framed by Lee's statue over his grave that Lee was a traitor for slavery. Man, it was a hard, but I had to tell my truth. And Charles did the same thing like a year later when he went back in and said the same thing, and framed by this statue of Lee as the altar. It's literally a place to worship Lee as a god, and it's still there.
Thank you. So let me go to one of the audience questions, and that's a short question. I'm going to try to fill in the background. I'm going to make up because I don't know what it actually is. But she's asked, what do African-American historians think of your work? And my guess is that question is being asked because you're both obviously middle-aged white guys, with tenure, et cetera. So what do people of color think of your work who are historians?
I'd have to say I've been very relieved and almost flattered by the reception that I've gotten. Um, I had an African-American colleague of mine here at Williams read the book. She suggested the title. I originally said The Making and Unmaking of a Racist was going to be my title. She said, "Do you want to sell books, Charles?" And I said, "Well, sure." And she said, "Make it The Making of a Racist." One of the things that's happened when I've given talks in public about my book, and I've done this a fair amount, I've always had a very well integrated audience. And I've been astonished at the number of older African Americans who have come up afterward and have thanked me for explaining to them where white racism came from. They never understood. And that to me was a gift that I hadn't anticipated. I wrote the book thinking about white folks and how we can get out from under this rock. But apparently it has also helped African Americans understand something that was visited upon them when they were 5, 6, 7 years old. And they had that moment in time when they realized the power of race and what it was going to mean in their lives. And they would also often tell me those moments when that happened. So I would have to say I've been very, very pleased and pleasantly surprised, I guess, that the book has been as well received as it has.
And I would say that's probably true for me too. I had a Black colleague read it, and he's at the University of Georgia, and he said, "Oh my gosh, this is just what my students need to read." So I had other positive comments from other Black friends who read it. But I have gotten, so I did a podcast recently where there was with a young Black woman who I think took me to task fairly for saying, "Why did it take you so long? You're a white privileged man with a great education who served in the military, and yet it took you so long to finally divest yourself completely of this racist thought, and particularly about thinking about the lost cause and Lee." And I don't really have a great answer for that other than it took me too daggum long. And it's a fair comment. So I think I have had that, but on the whole, it has been positive. I have given podcasts and talks to a variety of audiences, and it has been on the whole positive. Because the other part is, I think that Charles does the same thing, is that if you're not making excuses, which I don't think either one of us do, if you're not making excuses, then you're telling a story that needs to be told. And I also have particularly older Black men and women that have talked to me about that as well. And I continue to get the other thing that I continue to get lots of hate mail and people on Twitter and Facebook and others that do that. I had seen this previously when I did this video about 6 years ago on the cause of the Civil War, when said it was slavery, and it's had over 30 million views. And on that one, I got death threats. And I probably 10 to 1 negative comments by saying, because the Civil War was about slavery. This one, it has been overwhelmingly positive emails and comments that I've gotten from people of all persuasions compared to 6 years ago. So I think the views have changed dramatically over the time from when Charles wrote than now, I think.
And could I add something here? I think Grant has something to say to us, and I saw this in your book, and I underlined it. Let me just read it. For Grant, the war also saved the United States from slavery, quote, "an institution abhorrent to all civilized people not brought up under it." And you and I were brought up under that Jim Crow culture. We absorbed it like osmosis.
Yeah.
And following the lead of your family and people you know and love, and observing that they behave in a certain way around people of color. Those Jim Crow, the etiquette of race relations that governed the way we interacted. All of that was a definition of almost your self-worth. You behaved a certain way about Black people because you were a white person, and you were supposed to behave that way. And if you didn't, you were doing something wrong. And as Grant says, if you were brought up under slavery, you probably accepted that too. And whites in the Old South certainly did. The handful who didn't left the South.
Right.
So I think it's the power of racist culture that's being exhibited here. And what I would say to the young woman who asked you that, that's a very good question. And I'm not proud of the fact that it took me as long as it did, but that's testament to the power of the culture in which we grew up.
Yeah, in fact, culture is stronger than history.
Yeah.
And I think that's one thing I found is that culture is stronger than history. And overcoming culture, you can't do it with facts. You have to do it with stories. And stories like Charles tells about himself and stories that I tell about myself are ways of bridging this gap, because the history I like are stories like what Charles tells. And those stories can help us change our narrative. And this next generation, I hope, will not have that narrative.
So a couple of questions from the audience that are along this vein. And a question about, so how do you communicate with friends and family who were raised the way you were, so in a very racist society or culture, but haven't had the experiences you both had that have changed the way you view yourselves and your history, our history? So how do you communicate with those individuals? I mean, you talked about personal stories already, so that's one way of doing that, but how do you get them to see the world the way you now see the world that you didn't see, 40 years ago?
Both my parents were deceased when I published my book. My older brother, my only other sibling, my older brother, John, I did not send him the manuscript because I didn't want him to tell me, you can't publish this. So I sent him a copy of the book, and I sent it priority mail so I would know when it got to his mailbox, and I tracked it. And I knew when it arrived, and I knew about how long it would take him to read the first 3 chapters, which are the autobiographical part of the book. And about the time I thought he would call, he called. And he was in tears. And he thanked me for writing the book. And that's the one reaction to the book that has the most power for me. I've gotten hate mail, I've gotten good reviews, I've gotten mediocre reviews. The moment I remember most vividly is my brother on the phone.
And my dad is still alive. He's a hale and hearty, will be 90 next month, and still playing tennis regularly. And he used to tell me the story when he was growing up on the Gulf Coast of Mississippi, that he and his brother would race in church. Their church, good Episcopalians, that's where I grew up. They would race in church to sit in the seat, and there was a little plaque by it that said, "Here sat Jefferson Davis for church services after the Civil War." And there's one in Lee Chapel that says, "Here sat General Lee during church services." I don't know what it is about, but we have one at West Point that says, "Here sat Winfield Scott for church services." So there's something about plaques in churches. But I've certainly been talking to him about this for a long, long time. And sort of telling him the way my absolute changes about that. So I think first his pride in me as a son and seeing my name on a book was overcame anything else. And I think he's also again has understood that the way he grew up, that there were just enormous problems in it. And my sister, who read it, saw the lie long before she saw the lie really earlier than I did. Because I think there was also something, and I didn't write much about the book, it would have been another book, but just about men and this. There is something about masculinity and the male role in this racist society, that the gentleman, in a way, that has a different flavor and a deleterious, pernicious effect on masculinity and the way you're seen as a man, that was harder for me to overcome, that I think she was able not to. But so I don't have that much family that was affected by it, but my father was the main one. But I think it's been overall positive.
So another audience member has asked a question about history books. And he said, isn't there a saying that history is written by the winners? I think actually Churchill said that, and how did the history books come to glorify the Confederacy? So why is it that so many books that we've used for years and years and years focus on the lost cause, not on the true history of the Civil War?
The Confederates started rewriting the narrative right after the Civil War. You look at statements being made, some of the secession commissioners I wrote about in my little book on secession. I followed them after the war, and they tried to whitewash it immediately. They fought for liberty. They fought for the rights guaranteed the South under the Constitution. The same men who had been talking about preserving slavery and white supremacy by 1865, 66, 67 were beginning to rewrite the narrative. And that was perpetuated by generations of white Southerners, including Confederate veterans. There's a wonderful autobiography by a woman named Catherine Dupre Lumpkin, and she talks about her grandfather, who was a Civil War soldier and an active member of the United Confederate Veterans. And his motto was, teach the children. She remembered that over and over again, teach the children. The Confederates had the responsibility to convey the true, as they were now saying, the true causes of the war and what they were fighting for. And I think that just got replicated. It was in the history of Reconstruction, the blackout of honest government, that whole tarnished history of Reconstruction was put in place in the late 19th, early 20th century. The lost cause myth went right along with it.
And there are people like Mildred Rutherford of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, who is the historian, where she put out exactly what you're allowed to believe. And then they went searching in history textbooks to make sure it was the right thing. And when they found it wasn't, they would then write to the publisher and say, no, you can't do that. And then the UDC created Children of the Confederacy, where there's the Confederate Catechism. And it's still on their website today, where they still have the Children of the Confederacy. You can memorize the lost cause myths, and then from those lost cause myths, you can then win scholarships for it. And then during the massive resistance era, the textbooks I had as a kid in Virginia also were created by the state of Virginia to show that not only was slavery a good thing, but that, it's like both things. No, the Civil War wasn't about slavery, but yes, slavery was a good thing. And it was to show that the way the races were segregated was good in the 1950s and 1960s. So I continue to have these textbooks into the 1970s that were written for the state of Virginia to show that slavery was a good thing. The Civil War wasn't fought over slavery, and that it was the war between the states and the war of Northern aggression, and Lee was this great hero. So it was a concerted effort to ensure, again, another part of a white supremacist society.
Dan, let me just add to that. On my 14th birthday, I was given two things. I was given a copy of Douglas Southall Freeman's Lee's Lieutenants, which is the history of the Army of Northern Virginia, and I was given a .22 caliber rifle. That was a rite of passage for a boy in the South. You're 14, you're a man, you get a weapon, and you get a history of Lee's Army. One of my father's law partners gave me this little book. It's called Facts the Historians Leave Out, a Youth's Confederate Primer. I was given this at 14. You see the Confederate flags on the front. And this is the history of the South from the Confederate perspective. This is written by a relative, his ancestor fought for the South. The Yankees brought the slaves over here and are responsible for it. Us Southerners treated them well. We went to war to protect ourselves against Yankee abolitionists who were trying to stir up our contented Sambos, they called them. So you were fed this stuff. I mean, it just came to you. You didn't have to go out and seek it.
And if you have a racial, if your society is based on white supremacy, you've got to have an ideology to base it on. And there was a full and complete ideology to support a deeply racist society.
Absolutely.
With white political power, the end goal.
Yeah, there's one more piece of this too, which is that Texas for many, many years dominated the high school and elementary school book business. So what Texas bought, what they ordered, people all over the country used. And so Texas was able to dictate the curriculum in our schools in many, many ways that a lot of us don't recognize.
Yeah, history is dangerous because it goes after our myths and our identities. And when you go after someone's myth and their identities, the reaction can be ferocious.
Absolutely.
So a few of the audience members have asked questions relating to what's happening in today's world, looking at January 6th, looking at voter suppression in the South, looking at the recent rise in white supremacy. So I don't have a question for you as much as can you comment on what do you think are the causes for this resurgence and what's happening? That's this stuff that we thought we were past this stuff, right? We thought we were past voter suppression. We thought we were past trying to disenfranchise, huge swaths of our population, but we apparently have not gone past that. So can you comment on some of these things that are happening today and what your perspectives are as historians?
The attack on the Capitol on January 6th was a classic lynch mob, stirred up by a white supremacist provocateur. It's just that direct and that simple. They even erected a gallows and a noose on the Capitol grounds. They cried, "Hang Mike Pence," as they entered the building. There was a backlash to the Obama years, and we got a national leadership that was willing to play the race card over and over and over again. Black and brown voters in places like Atlanta and Detroit and Milwaukee, Philadelphia had stolen the election from his voters, overwhelmingly white voters. And he riled up the mob and set them loose. And it was deja vu all over again for any Southern historian who had studied this stuff in the past. Racist demagogues are our stock and trade as historians of the South, and we were watching one in action. That's about as directly and as bluntly as I can put it.
That was excellent. I mean, I think it's so true. Somebody once said, "Oh, this was so un-American." Oh, please. Racial violence to enforce racial for racial control is as American as apple pie. So yeah, we're probably I don't know that there's another developed country that is as violent politically as we are. And I certainly, as a soldier, when I saw that insurrection, sedition, I was ready to put the uniform back on. I'm telling you, it was deeply troubling for me to see it. But it also shows that racism is the virus in the American dirt. I mean, it's in a way, it's our eternal pandemic. The idea that we've ever gotten beyond this seems to me no. And in fact, we have to fight against racism all the time, or we go back to center. And center is almost racist, is racism in the country. And you can see that in the not just in the South, but when I was in the station of West Point, right outside the town is Highland Falls, tiny little town. And I was talking to somebody about my research, and their housing covenant still said, this is in New York, you shall not sell to a Negro. So housing covenants throughout the country have these. Palo Alto had them. Los Angeles had them. So the racism is not dead. It's not gone. It's there. And that's why it requires a fight against it at all times, or it comes back quickly.
So another question, this is from another audience member. Self-knowledge can be transformative for an individual, but as you say, culture is a powerful force in sustaining racism. The Army is often seen as one of the institutions that addressed racism, especially during and after World War II. What can the efforts that were used in the Army teach us about how to abolish or address racism outside of the Army?
Well, I think you've got to remember that the Army changes when our political bosses tell us to change. And they told us to change in 1948, and yet the Army and the Marine Corps and the Navy still slow rolled it as much as they possibly could. And at West Point, our barracks were still segregated up until 1954. So we fought against that. We're not a perfect record. We have tried of late to be better, and I would say that the military is one of the most integrated parts of American society, and one where you are likely to have a black boss. But it doesn't mean we don't have the same problems that the rest of America does. We just work on them all the time, and even then they still come out. So, we're looking now about whether we have a white supremacist problem within the military. And the answer is yes, we do have a problem with it. These are we have we bring in 10,000 people a month into the U.S. Army alone. And so that turnover means that you've got to fight against these issues all the time. So, but we do fight against them. The Department of Defense just had a extremism stand down day, so that every unit in the entire Department of Defense will start working against this. And we have also had these against sexual harassment, sexual assault. So we are supposed to be an obedience-based organization in the military. We do what we're told. But often that comes when our political bosses tell us to. And in the last administration, when you have a political boss who is fomenting racism, then that is going to show itself in the military. And so now where we've got, and I've met Secretary Lloyd Austin, he's a superb leader. These politicians are going to try to go after that problem, which was fomented in the last administration, but it requires constant work.
Charles, anything to add?
Pardon?
Anything to add?
I think Ty has really put his finger on it. In reading what he had to say about the military and integration, and how Truman said in 1948, do it, but it took the Korean War and the necessity of getting those men into combat units and putting every man in the field who could carry a rifle to actually integrate the military. The pushback, the racist pushback, is almost always going to be there. We planted this seed of slavery in the Republic at its birth, and it's been metastasizing for centuries. And we're trying to deal with it now in ways that will be permanent. And it's a fight. And there's a rear guard that's always gonna push back against advancement. Every time you take a step forward, there are gonna be white folks who say, that's too far, too fast. And you've just gotta keep your shoulder to the wheel, it seems to me.
So let me bring this down to a very local and practical level for a moment. Ty, on your website, you mentioned how people can go about changing the names of buildings, streets, etc., in their localities. And let's just say there was one in Reading, and someone says, you know what, I want to change that name. I think it reflects a person who's racist or whatever. So can you just tell us what your recommendations are for going about trying to make a change like that?
Yes, in fact, I just got a note. One of the best emails I've gotten was from from a girl who is trying to change her high school name. Or her elementary school, I can't even remember which one. And she's following it, which is basically identify who it is, find out who it is. In other words, what's the story? You've got to have a story about who this person is so that people can understand it. Talk about how it doesn't represent the values of your community. Remember, there's a difference between history and commemoration. Is this somebody who should be commemorated? And then get some local historians, whether it's in the local historical society, it's in the local college, it's in the high school, so that you look at it in context. I mean, that's one of the things that we historians do, is look at it in context. Then once you've got that ready to go, then you start your finding allies. And those allies could be the League of Women Voters, or it could be the NAACP, it could be the Urban League, it could be whoever it is, so that you have allies for that. And then social media is really good for this, starting a website, finding allies, and then figuring out how your local town changes the names of things, and starting a petition to do that. People have been unbelievably successful in getting these changed, which is great. And, in 100 years, we may want to change it again. If you look now, who are most statues going up to right now in America? It's sports heroes. Sports heroes are the ones where we have statues. Every one of these new stadiums that come up, they're sports heroes. In 100 years, they may look at us and go, "Are you kidding me? That's who you think is worthy of commemoration?" And in 100 years, maybe they want to change it. But right now, who we commemorate should represent the values of that community. And every local community has the ability to change that through action. And that's one of the things I love about this country, is that we do have that ability, and it works.
So one more question from an audience member, and this is somebody from the South. And she says, I am from West Virginia, which views itself as Southern. has a Southern culture, yet was created during the Civil War for siding with the North. Most of my family reveres Lee and has a definite segregation or segregated culture. How did this happen? I always felt it was a paradox to me.
West Virginia is an interesting case. My mother was from Huntington, West Virginia, and West Virginia was an area of Virginia that always felt that it had been mistreated by the Eastern plantation owners. Slavery was in West Virginia, but not in the numbers. And they were more oriented toward Ohio, the Ohio River. Wheeling was more an Ohio town than a Virginia town. That area simply was looking for a way to finally get its political independence and to get recognized from the domination of the eastern part. West Virginia never disfranchised voters. West Virginia didn't pass segregation laws. It stood out, maybe because of its sort of Appalachian quality. It stood as an outlier in much of the Jim Crow South. So West Virginia has a proud history in many ways. It's also been a poor state, and the dependence on coal has been, I think, a mixed blessing. So Virginia's what my father would call a special breed of cat. And you just have to think of it as being slightly outside the mainstream of the things we've been talking about today.
So before we conclude, I have one last question. And I'm an occasional listener of the Ezra Klein podcast, it's the Ezra Klein Show. And he always ends his interviews by asking his guests to name 3 books they recommend to audience members to learn more about the topics they're discussing in that particular episode. So rather than asking for 3, I'll just ask each of you for 1. So what is one book, and you cannot recommend each other's books, by the way, that doesn't count here. We already know about those books. We already want to read those books. But what is there one other book you'd recommend that our listeners should read to learn more about our history of this, the Civil War, so the true history of the Civil War, the true history of what's happened since then? I'll leave it kind of wide open to you, but just what else should we read?
I would recommend, and this is not exactly about the Civil War, I would recommend Anne Moody's autobiography, Coming of Age in Mississippi. It's written by a young African-American girl growing up in the Mississippi Delta. And it is a brilliant book and a moving story. And if you want to know what life was like to be African-American in the South, read Anne Moody's Coming of Age in Mississippi.
That's a great book. I was looking at The Lost Cause. So the one that I think is most accessible is the great late writer Tony Horowitz's Confederates in the Attic, which is a brilliant and lovely book and a crazy book talking about how this was, in this case, reenactors, but it's just trying to understand the hold that Confederates have on the psyche of the South and why. And luckily, I think the reenactor movement is starting to die down. And the book is about 20 years old, but it does try to look at and understand why people continue to hold this 1 4-year period in such regard, despite its absolute defeat and destruction.
So let me thank you both once again for your valuable time and your insight into U.S. history and for sharing your personal stories. I've heard them before, but hearing them again, I could hear them again and again. You're both fantastic storytellers, and then you tell important stories that we need to hear, need to understand, need to try to apply to our own lives in some ways. So thank you both. I also want to thank once again the Mark Twain Library and the Reading League of Women Voters. I want to turn the podium back over to Eric Ruberry, who's the president of the Mark Twain Library Board. So Eric, back to you.
Thank you very much. On behalf of all sponsors and supporters who made this program possible, we extend our deepest thanks to you, Dr. Daniel Barrett, Dr. Charles Dew, and Dr. Ty Sudgely. And it is with gratitude that we thank the Reading League of Women Voters and the staff and volunteers of the Mark Twain Library for making this production possible. This evening's conversation will be just as enlightening, I feel, in rerun. So don't forget to spread the word about the library's YouTube channel. And of course, thanks to all who joined us here this evening. Once again, thank you. Good night. Stay safe and be well.
Thank you and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.